Well, I mean, essentially, Bruges is a huge production hub in the 14th century. It's part of Ypres, Ghent, but it makes a shift towards financial services. So, in the 1420s, I mean, after sort of economical crises, it becomes sort of increasingly clear that Bruges is the new hub of commerce and trade, and with it comes essentially a lot of people from either Germany, from the Germanic countries, or from Italy, Spain, that are residing in Bruges, and they form this kind of diaspora. And there are in financial services, there are maritime insurers, there are people who are trading, there are people who are sort of developing financial instruments. You have, in the 14th century already, you have the Dantini, then you have the Medici, you have their correspondents, you have their branches, and they are sort of catering to the needs of, well, the trade, but also of the needs to the financial needs of the Dukes of Burgundy. And so you have to imagine it's kind of a very affluent environment that shifts a little bit in the 30s with the big crisis, and we have Pero Tafour who comes to town and tells us that this is a great place to live if you have a lot of money. If you're a poor man, it's probably not the place you want to be, and tells us that you can basically buy everything there. So there is this kind of vibrancy of commerce and trade that attracts artists from not only all over the Netherlands but also beyond that. There are German artists. There are even in the 16th century people from Italy come to Bruges to work there, like Ambrosius Benson, and and then you have like what we call the luxury productions, the panel painters, the people in the jewelry business who are basically sort of like working what has sometimes been called this conspicuous consumption, to produce like beautiful objects that are rare, that are costly, and that cater to elite tastes. Yeah. I think they're both. I mean, the letter is very clear. It's sort of like it has both ends to it. It's sort of like there are religious paintings. They have a, if they're not portraits, they have a a primarily religious function as altarpieces, memorials, epitaphs, votive paintings, name it. But they do at the same time they sort of like cater to the idea of visual surrogates, and you have costly garments displayed in a very almost haptical way, that you have the idea that you can actually grab the cloth of the cannons and sort of get them away. The same is true with jewelry. I mean, if you look at the way that Van Eyck, for example, paints little pearls and jewels, sort of like that are embroidered into the gowns of the Virgin Mary, and you have the idea that there's a very clear idea of how to depict that. It's a surrogate of the real thing, and it's actually something that many painters who are not in the Low Countries try to emulate. So if you look at Spanish painters of the period, Luis Dalmau, that is precisely what they're going after when they're trying to emulate, Netherlandish paintings. The patrons are, there are manifold. We have, in the first place, of course, the ducal patronage, that is sort of the immediate circle of the Duke and the Duchess, Isabella of Portugal. You have, on top of that, you have the patronage of the court, which are courtiers that are, in the entourage of the Duke. The ducal administrators like Nicolas Rollin, Chancellor of Burgundy, Jean Chevreul, the Bishop of Tournai, and Burgundian churchmen, who are very much sort of like defining this kind of Burgundian taste, and they are coming to artists ordering altarpieces for their own chapels or their own foundations. And then you have local clerics like Joris van der Pale or Jan Vos, who are commissioning works like that. And you have, of course, the affluent bourgeoisie, if you want to call them that, and thereby I mean most of all Italian patrons who are apparently attracted to this kind of new form of realism, and they invest in their portraiture and buy altarpieces, small traveling altarpieces that they keep in Bruges for a period while they're there, and then take home, and so it's a rather international art center at that period. Yeah. I mean, essentially, what you have, and you again, it's always useful to detach yourself from the specific situation and hover a little bit above the floor and to look what's actually happening. If you look above the horizon, there is a kind of, I mean, the court painters did exist before, and there has always been a kind of continuity. So the Count of Flanders, Louis of Male, Ludwig van Male, has a court painter called Melchior Bruderlam that actually is re-employed by Philip the Bold, the grandfather of Philip the Good, at the moment that Louis of Male dies. Jan van Eyck is first recorded as court painter at the court of Johann of Bayern, Jean of Bavaria, who is the Count of Holland and Hennegauen. And at the moment that Johann of Bayern dies, he is actually sort of like re-employed by Philip the Good and becomes his court painter. For the time being, sort of the first thing what happens, he is moving to Lille, the administrative center of the Burgundian Netherlands, and works from there for a couple of years. He is sort of dispatched by the Duke for several travels, for which he is sort of richly reimbursed. He is participating in Burgundian envoy to the Iberian Peninsula in order to negotiate, or he's part of the envoy that negotiates the marriage between Philip the Good and Isabella of Portugal. And then around 1432 he actually gets kind of leave of absence from the court. He is not any longer a familiaris at the court, but sort of like establish his workshops in Bruges, and he has apparently the right to work for not exclusively to the court, but also to have other commissions, which is actually the same what happened decades before with Melchior Bruderlam as well. Yeah. We don't know. We know that he actually made portraits. We know that he actually was there in order to record the likeness of Isabella of Portugal, and that these likenesses were sent towards the Burgundian Netherlands so they could be inspected by the Duke, and then he could sort of prepare himself either for the best or for the worst of the period, depending how you looked at it, and apparently traveled quite extensively the period together with the other people. We don't have too much specific information on what he did when he was down there, but he was one of the highest paid members of that envoy. There were only two, I think, officials from Burgundy. One is Baudouin de Lannoy, and one is the brother of Baudouin de Lannoy, who actually paid more than Jan van Eyck on that particular trip. So, if we are asking ourselves, so what is the purpose of a painter on the road? We have not much information by the way of facts, but there are, of course, huge amounts of speculative ideas that are important and that can be looked at, including cartography, I suppose. If you're a duke and you have a painter who is known to be a great landscape painter, you might actually want to have him, measuring distances and sort of like making cartography as well. I mean, what you have in the 15th century and in the 14th century already is sort of like there is a growing awareness, say, out of the medieval concept of the workshop, which is kind of a collective style, an anonymous collective style. You get this kind of first, records of names, and court artists are mentioned, and they are rare, and they're going from one court to the other because they are so, well skilled that their skills is actually something which is thought after. And we have, with Jan van Eyck, we have this remarkable statement of Philip the Good, who, after his treasury sort of like is a little bit late in paying the painter his expenses, he writes a letter to the treasury and says, "Oh, you have to pay this guy now, because if he loses, I don't find anybody of the art and science that Jan van Eyck has." So there was a kind of a leverage that the artist had at that period in order ask and to have his demands fulfilled. It's probably not such a coincidence that these are the first moments that we actually have sort of also record of growing self-consciousness on behalf of the artist, sort of like away from the purely sort of like craftsmanship towards specialized craftsmanship, where skills and individual skills become more and more important. I mean, you have to think that that skills are rare and that people are traveling a lot. If you look at the 14th century again, around 1400, you have in the same you have the Visconti trying to build the Cathedral of Milano, and then in this there are people from the north traveling towards Milano. There is a miniature painter from Paris who's actually from Bruges, Jacques Kuhn, who is specifically sort of like asked down there apparently because he had skills to make drawings that are useful for sculptures to make facades and all these kind of things. So, we have to think about these kind of extremely skilled laborers whose skills are rare and they're sought after and they become kind of international. And of course, if you think about what you mentioned, prestige, it's very well thinkable that Jan van Eyck, that Philip de Gould employed somebody like Jan van Eyck on a international mission to show, hey, I have one of the best painters in the whole world. And again, if you look in the 15th century and records that are written about the artworks, then all of a sudden it becomes very clear that it is Jan van Eyck, the court painter, or the illustrious, generous, fantastic, great Duke of Burgundy. And you can see that apparently the prestige of the artist contributed greatly to the magnificence of the pattern that was behind.